Hands from the walls. The first thing I noticed after the renovation was how quiet the apartment had become. Almost too quiet. It was a kind of silence that pressed against my eardrums, filling the air with a heavy, invisible weight. The contractors had stripped the place down to its bones: new drywall, polished hardwood floors, a coat of white paint that gleamed under the cold LED lights. It was my first real place, a little one-bedroom in an old brick building on the edge of downtown Chicago. The kind of spot that's full of character, as the landlord described it, which in hindsight should have been my first warning. Still, it felt like a fresh start, and I needed one. The first night was uneventful, aside from the occasional creak of the old radiators. By the third night, I began noticing the cracks. They weren't there when I moved in, or at least, I hadn't seen them. Thin, almost hairline fractures running vertically along the walls in the living room and the hallway. At first, I blamed the cold. It was February, and the Chicago winter had a way of making everything contract and groan. I figured it was normal for a building this old, shrugged it off, and went about my week. But then the handprints started. The first one appeared on the wall just outside my bathroom. I'd gotten out of the shower, wiped the steam off the mirror, and noticed it in the reflection. A faint smudge, the size of a child's hand, with long, bony fingers splayed wide. At first, I thought maybe it was me, some kind of weird transfer from dust or grime on my own hands. But when I placed my palm against the mark, it didn't fit. The fingers were too long, the shape too narrow. It was like someone had pressed their hand into the wall and left a ghost of themselves behind. I scrubbed it off with a wet cloth, convinced it was just a fluke. But over the next few days, more handprints began to appear. On the wall by my bed. On the inside of the closet door. Even on the ceiling above the kitchen sink. Always faint, like they'd been left in a thin layer of dust, but unmistakable. They were all different sizes too. Some small, others large enough to belong to a basketball player, and all of them with those unnaturally long fingers. I tried cleaning them, repainting over a couple, but nothing seemed to stop them. By the end of the week, I was losing sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd see those prints in my mind, creeping across the walls like a fungus. I started hearing things at night too, soft, rhythmic thuds, like someone knocking from the other side of the drywall. At first, I thought it might be my upstairs neighbor, a heavy-set guy I'd seen hauling an enormous flat screen into the building when I moved in. But the sounds didn't come from above. They came from the walls. Slow and deliberate, like knuckles rapping against plaster. I called my landlord, of course. Left him a voicemail about the cracks and the noises, even mentioned the handprints, though I felt stupid saying it out loud. He didn't call back. A day later, I left a second voicemail. Then a third. Nothing. It wasn't until I stormed into the leasing office that I got his attention. His name was Lou, a wiry guy in his late 50s with nicotine-stained fingers and the perpetually annoyed expression of someone who hated his job but needed the paycheck. Cracks are normal in a building this old, he said, barely looking up from his desk. Settling, you know? Probably just your imagination running wild. And the handprints? I asked, my voice edging into desperation. What about the noises at night? You think I'm imagining those too? He sighed and leaned back in his chair, the springs creaking. Look, lady, this place has been standing since the 1930s. People have lived and died in these walls. Maybe it's just a little leftover energy. Happens in old buildings all the time. You want me to send an exterminator or something? Energy? I repeated, incredulous. What the hell does that even mean? Lou shrugged. Ghosts, spirits, whatever you want to call it. Doesn't mean they're bad. Just, there. If it bothers you that much, maybe burn some sage or get one of those salt lamps. My wife swears by hers. I left the office fuming, but his words stuck with me. Ghosts. Spirits. I didn't believe in that crap, or at least, I didn't think I did. But as the days passed and the knocking grew louder, more insistent, I found myself second-guessing everything. The handprints were multiplying now, covering entire sections of the wall like a grotesque mural. And every night, the knocking seemed to move closer, like whatever was inside the walls was trying to find its way out. Then, one night, I heard the whispering. It started as a low hum, barely audible over the sound of the wind rattling the windows. I tried to ignore it at first, chalking it up to my mind playing tricks on me after days of no sleep. But as the night wore on, the hum turned into something more distinct, words, though muffled and distorted, as if they were coming from the other side of the world. I sat up in bed, straining my ears, my heart pounding in my chest. The words were unmistakable now, though I couldn't quite make them out. They sounded like whispers, soft and pleading, as if someone was trying to reach me. The air in the room felt thick, heavier than usual, like the walls themselves were breathing, pulling in and out with each shallow exhale. I could feel my skin prickling, my body instinctively pulling the covers tighter around me as though that could somehow shield me from whatever was lurking in the dark. The knocking was back, only it wasn't coming from the usual places anymore. It was coming from everywhere. The walls, the ceiling, the floor. A steady, rhythmic pounding that seemed to echo in every corner of the apartment, as if the whole place was alive and trying to break free. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, trying to focus on the floor in front of me, but everything seemed off. The shadows were wrong, stretching unnaturally along the floor and creeping up the walls. And then I saw it. A shadowy shape, long and thin, shifting just out of the corner of my eye. I whipped my head around, but there was nothing there. I stared at the space in front of me, waiting for the world to settle back into place, but it didn't. The shadows kept moving, sliding along the edges of the walls like they were alive, like they were waiting for something, or someone. I could feel my pulse quickening, my breath shallow and uneven. The knocking was louder now, like fists pounding on the walls from inside. The whispers were clearer, and I could almost make out the words, "Let me out, please." The thought hit me like a punch to the stomach. What if it wasn't just the house settling? What if there was something trapped inside? I stood up, my legs shaky, and walked to the hallway, the flashlight beam dancing nervously ahead of me. The wall seemed to close in as I moved, the space around me growing tighter, more suffocating. The handprints on the walls were now darker, deeper, as though they had been pressed into the surface, with growing force. They spread across the hallway like veins, twisting and writhing in unnatural patterns, almost as if they were alive. I reached out, my hand trembling, but stopped just short of touching them. Something in the back of my mind screamed at me to turn back, to leave the apartment, to forget this ever happened. But I couldn't. Not now. Not with whatever it was inside these walls, trying to break free. The whispers were louder now, more insistent. I could hear them behind the drywall, just inches from my ear, urging me on. I had to know what it was. I had to know what had been left behind in the bones of this old building. I found a crowbar in the closet, an old rusty tool I'd never bothered to use. My hands were shaking as I pried at the edges of the wall in the living room, where the handprints were the darkest. The wood splintered with a loud crack, sending a jolt of panic through me. I paused for a moment, breathing heavily, my heart hammering in my chest, before forcing the crowbar deeper into the gap. The drywall gave way with a sharp snap, and I gasped as the air around me shifted. It was colder now, almost freezing, and the whispering grew louder, more frantic. I could feel something behind the wall, pushing against it, desperate to get out. My breath came in short, panicked bursts as I pulled more of the drywall away, my eyes widening in horror at the sight that emerged from the darkness. At first, I thought it was a mistake, some kind of trick of the light or my tired mind playing games. But as I peeled the last of the drywall off, I saw them. Hands. Dozens of hands, all pressed against the exposed plaster, their fingers splayed wide, each one distinct, almost lifelike, as if they were waiting for me to touch them. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. They were real. I didn't know how, but they were. And they were moving, twitching slightly as if they were alive, as if they were waiting for someone to reach out and make contact. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to run, to leave this place behind and never look back. But another part of me, the part that had been listening to the whispers for days, knew that I couldn't stop now. I had to know what was trapped in the walls. I reached out, my hand trembling as I brushed against the nearest handprint. The moment my fingers made contact, the air in the room seemed to shift. The temperature dropped drastically, and the knocking from the walls intensified, now a deafening roar that rattled my bones. My heart raced as I jerked my hand back, but it was too late. Something inside the wall was moving, pulling me in. The walls groaned as if in pain, the entire apartment trembling with a force that seemed to come from deep within. The whispers turned into screams, loud, guttural sounds of desperation that filled every corner of the room. I tried to pull away, but my feet felt glued to the floor, my body frozen with fear. And then, from the darkness behind the wall, I heard a voice so familiar, so real, it made my blood run cold. "Help me." It was my voice. My own voice, distorted, but unmistakable. I don't remember much after that. I remember the darkness closing in, the hands reaching for me, and the cold. The cold that seemed to freeze me in place, trapping me in that moment, in that apartment, forever. When I woke up, I was back in bed, the first rays of dawn creeping through the window. Everything was silent again. The knocking had stopped. The handprints were gone. But I could still feel them, behind the walls, waiting. I don't think I'll ever leave this place. The morning light felt like a lie, washing over the room with a false sense of peace. I sat up slowly, rubbing my eyes, the remnants of the dream, or was it real, still clinging to my thoughts. The apartment seemed normal again, the walls smooth and undisturbed, the air warm and quiet. It was as if the events of the night before had never happened. But I knew better. I could still feel the presence behind the walls, a weight that settled deep in my chest. The handprints, the whispering, the knocking, they were still there, lingering in the corners of my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting, just out of reach, like a hand poised to grab my ankle from the dark. I spent the next few days trying to convince myself that I had imagined it all. That maybe the exhaustion from the move, the stress of settling into a new place, had finally cracked my mind. But the quiet terror that gnawed at my gut wouldn't go away. The walls, now smooth and unmarked, felt wrong, like they were hiding something. I tried to ignore it, tried to go about my routine, work, errands, cooking dinner, but no matter what I did, I couldn't escape the feeling that I was being watched. The knocking started again on the fourth night. It was softer this time, like a distant tapping, a faint rattle against the walls that I almost convinced myself was just the house settling. But it grew louder as the hours stretched on. It wasn't a random sound anymore, it was deliberate, calculated. The knocks were too rhythmic, too intentional, to be ignored. They came from all sides, at once, as if something inside the walls was moving, clawing, trying to get out. I couldn't breathe. I grabbed my phone, fingers trembling as I texted Lou, asking if someone could come by to check the place. There was no response, of course. I hadn't heard from him in days. I tossed the phone aside and stood up, my heart pounding in my chest, the sound of the knocks vibrating in my skull. I had to do something. I had to figure out what was happening. Without thinking, I grabbed the crowbar again. My hands were slick with sweat as I pried at the wall near the kitchen, the same spot where I had found the handprints before. The moment the drywall cracked, I froze. There was no turning back now. I pulled the crowbar further into the gap, and the wall gave way with a sickening crunch. I pushed the rubble aside, my hands shaking, heart racing as I peered into the dark space behind the wall. My flashlight flickered as I shone it inside, and that's when I saw them, more hands, pressed against the drywall from the other side, just like before, but this time they were different. These hands were moving. Twisting, jerking against the wall, like they were alive, trying to break free. I stepped back, stumbling, the cold sweat now soaking through my shirt. My breath was coming in short, panicked gasps as the whispers returned, louder than ever. I couldn't understand them, but they were there, inside my head, pressing against my mind like a suffocating fog. The walls were groaning, the apartment shaking with a low, rumbling sound as if it were about to collapse. I should have run. I should have left. But I couldn't. I had to know. I had to understand what was happening in this place, what they wanted. With a trembling hand, I reached out and touched the cold surface of the wall where the hands were pushing against it. The moment my fingers made contact, the room exploded in noise, a deafening crack, followed by the sound of something heavy crashing against the floor. The walls buckled and shifted, and I was thrown backward, landing hard on the hardwood floor with a grunt. I gasped for air, my vision blurry, but I didn't have time to focus. Something was coming through the wall, something large and alive. The knocking grew louder, pounding in my chest like a heartbeat. The walls creaked as they split open, and I saw them, figures emerging from the shadows, their long, pale fingers stretching toward me, their faces distorted, twisted in agony. I screamed and scrambled back, my feet slipping on the floor, but the figures kept coming, their hands reaching for me, their fingers brushing against my skin. I tried to push them away, but they were everywhere now, crawling from the cracks in the walls, their bodies too large to fit, but somehow still slipping through. One of them grabbed my wrist, and the cold, clammy skin of its hand sent a shock of ice through my body. I tried to scream again, but no sound came out. It pulled me closer, its face inches from mine, and I could smell it, a sickening, damp odor that filled my lungs. It spoke in a voice that wasn't its own. A voice that was mine. "Help me." I froze. The voice, my voice, rang in my ears, echoing in the room. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. This couldn't be real. It couldn't be real. The figure's eyes, black and hollow, like empty pits, stared at me, unblinking, as if it were waiting for something. For me. To make a choice. To do something. "Help me," it repeated, its voice growing louder, more insistent. My mind raced. I had to get away. I had to get out. With a sudden surge of panic, I jerked my arm free from its grip, stumbling backward, knocking into the chair behind me. The figures, no, the hands, reached for me, but I was already running. I didn't stop, didn't look back as I burst out the door, down the hallway, and into the stairwell. I kept running until I reached the street, until the chill of the night air hit my face, and I felt the ground beneath my feet. But even as I stood there, gasping for breath, I could feel it, the presence, still behind me, inside me, waiting for me to return. And no matter how far I ran, I knew that it would never let me go. Because it was in the walls. And it was waiting for me to come back. The city around me felt cold and distant, a blur of lights and noise that I could hardly register. My heart was still pounding, blood rushing in my ears as I stumbled along the sidewalk. I had to keep moving, keep running, but my legs felt like lead. I wasn't sure if I was escaping the apartment, or if I was simply trying to outrun the fear that was now embedded deep within me. It wasn't just the walls anymore, it was everything. The air, the streets, the sound of my own footsteps, they all felt wrong, as if the world itself had shifted somehow, and I was just a puppet struggling to break free from the strings. I didn't know where I was going, or why I couldn't stop. My phone buzzed in my pocket, Lou. I didn't want to hear from him, didn't want to hear anything from anyone. I felt like I was drowning in a sea of unanswered questions. What had happened in that apartment? What was waiting for me behind the walls? And why couldn't I shake the feeling that I was still there, trapped in the place where the hands had reached for me? I tried to ignore the buzzing, but it kept coming, louder this time, until it felt like it was vibrating through my bones. Reluctantly, I pulled it out and answered. "Hey, what's up?" I tried to sound casual, but the strain in my voice was undeniable. "Where are you? I've been calling you for hours, why haven't you answered?" Lou's voice crackled through the speaker, anxious, but still holding that familiar, unshakable calm. I needed some air," I said, barely able to make sense of my own words. "Listen, something's wrong. Something's really wrong with the apartment. You have to come." The phone went dead in my hand. The call dropped without warning, leaving only a hollow silence behind. My breath caught in my throat. It felt like the world was slipping through my fingers, like the connection to everything I once knew was breaking down. I tried to call him back, but the signal was gone. It wasn't just the call. It was like the entire city was fading away, and I was left stranded in some liminal space between here and whatever the hell that apartment had been. I kept walking. At some point, I found myself in front of a small diner, its neon sign flickering in the dark like a desperate pulse. I didn't want to go in. But my legs had carried me there, and I couldn't stop them. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The diner was empty, save for a lone waitress who barely glanced up as I entered. The place smelled of old coffee and stale grease, and the light was dim, casting long shadows across the empty booths. I slid into a seat at the counter, my hand still shaking. The waitress appeared beside me, her face impassive, as if she'd seen it all before. "Coffee?" she asked, her voice flat. I nodded, unable to speak. The silence stretched on, suffocating and thick. It felt like hours passed before the coffee arrived, and even then, I didn't touch it. The cup sat in front of me, steaming gently, but it might as well have been poison. My eyes kept darting to the door, to the window beyond, but nothing looked familiar anymore. Everything felt like a dream, like a nightmare that I couldn't wake up from. Suddenly, the bell above the diner door jingled, and I looked up. Lou stood in the doorway. He looked different, no, not different, but off. His face was pale, drawn tight with exhaustion, and his eyes had that distant look again, like he wasn't really here. He glanced around the diner, and when his eyes locked onto mine, I felt a chill slide down my spine. "I tried to call you," he said, his voice eerily quiet. "I didn't get through, but I felt like I should come find you." I didn't know what to say. He wasn't making sense. He couldn't have known. No one knew what had happened in the apartment. It was impossible. "Lou," I whispered, my voice barely audible, "you can't be here. It's not safe. The hands, they're in the walls. They're everywhere." He didn't respond. He just stood there, staring at me, his face unreadable. For a long moment, there was nothing but the sound of my breath, harsh and shallow, echoing in my ears. Then, slowly, he reached out and placed his hand on the counter between us. I recoiled, my heart racing as the image of the hands from the wall flashed in my mind. But Lou's hand, it wasn't right. His skin was too pale, too smooth, and it looked like it was stretching, like it didn't belong to him. "Lou," I began, but before I could finish, his hand jerked, pulling away with a loud crack. The sound echoed through the diner, and the waitress flinched, her eyes widening in terror. I looked back at Lou, but he wasn't standing there anymore. In his place was something that couldn't have been him. It was still Lou's face, still his eyes, but the skin was stretching and warping, pulling outward like it was trying to break free. The figure grinned, a wide, sickening smile that twisted its face into something unrecognizable. And then, in a voice that wasn't Lou's, it said, "It's time for you to come back." I stood up, my chair scraping against the floor as I backed away. I didn't look back. I couldn't. All I could hear was the sound of my own pulse hammering in my ears, louder than anything else. The door swung open again, and another figure stepped in. Another person from my past, from the apartment, but their eyes were empty, hollow, just like the others. And they, too, spoke in a voice that wasn't their own. "We've been waiting for you." I ran. I didn't know where, or how, or why, but I ran, the cold air biting at my skin as I pushed myself harder, faster, away from everything. And the whole time, I could feel them, following me, just out of sight. The hands. The whispers. But what I didn't know, what I couldn't understand, was that they weren't just after me. They were after all of us. And they would never stop. Because the walls had never been a barrier. They had been a doorway. And once you crossed that threshold, there was no going back.